All right, welcome back. This is the Something Venture podcast. I am Kent Lindstrom. I am a partner of the venture firm 8 Bit Capital and the host of this podcast. Thanks so much for coming back. Today's just incredible that I get to say this, but Nolan Bushnell, along with Dr. Leah Hanes, and we'll tell you who she is in a moment. Nolan Bushnell is on today. And, it's hard to overstate what he's done in his career, but let's start with this. He founded the video game industry. He's founder of Atari. The first time people saw their first game, which was Pong, it just blew people's minds and has become what is the incredible, video game industry today. It's one of those rare, entrepreneurs are rare enough, but one of those rare people who then started a second incredibly successful company, which is, if you can believe it, it's Chuck E. Cheese, which is still around today. That was him as well. And to do the rest of his career, I'll do it a disservice by trying to get it all. But he did a number of really interesting companies even after that, including a very early version of, what would have been Amazon 10 years before Amazon, basically, before the technology was there. And he was the first boss of Steve Jobs, the Apple founder. And I think he even has a story in there where he could have, Nolan could have bought, 25% of Apple for $50,000, one of those stories. I think so. Just an incredible career. And so he turns his thoughts over time to the state of education and has the thought that, maybe all these things we've done in the video game industry, if you look at the amount of time and mastery people put into those games, couldn't we take those technologies and apply them to education and get similar amounts of energy and focus and advancement in education? And so he, along with Dr. Leah Hanes, an expert in the field, put together the ExoDexa platform, which is designed to address these things. And they write a book about their thoughts on the topic called Shaping the Future of Education, the ExoDexa Manifesto. And so he and Dr. Leah Hanes, his partner in this conversation, will hear them talking about education and what we can do to transform it. And I would point out a couple things to you that struck me, and maybe you listen for them as you listen to this. Number one, think about what they're talking about in terms of the outcomes they are hopeful about getting. They're not talking about making education 20% better or kids learn, 50% faster. They're talking about the opportunity to have 10x and 20x multiples in education of kids. So that's kind of a crazy thought that hadn't occurred to me, and you'll hear them flesh that out here. And then the second thing that's really interesting is the state of new young teachers. And they ask you to imagine, and you'll see how they put it, but imagine what happens as a teacher who has grown up on video games and cell phones and all kinds of amazing technologies, comes into a classroom that perhaps today has none of these tools, if you can believe it. A bit of a mind-blowing concept. So a pretty mind-opening conversation here. I am proud to say that my guests today are Nolan Bushnell and Dr. Leah Hanes. This is the Something Venture podcast. Thanks so much for being here. All right, welcome back. This is the Something Venture podcast. I'm Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. My guests today, there are two of them, Dr. Leah Hanes and Nolan Bushnell. How are you guys doing?
Very well. Yeah.
I'm really excited about this. Dr. Hanes.
You can call me Leah.
I want to get it right the first time, Leah. But is called a doctor because she's a thought leader in the area, and we'll explain what this means in the area of STEAM. Is the CEO of the fabulously named Two Bit Circus and also the CEO of ExoDexa, which she co-founded with Nolan Bushnell, who, changed the world in 1972 when we saw that little ball move across the screen, founded Atari, founded Chuck E. Cheese, putting him in that rare group of people who've started two huge companies. Another one was Steve Jobs. I think he might have hired that guy as well. Steve Jobs went on to start a computer company. And then Nolan and Leah founded ExoDexa, which is an education company that uses games. So thank you guys so much for doing this.
My pleasure.
So maybe I'll start with with Nolan, how you got here. You start these two amazing companies, and then many more companies than that. I followed it. I think you had an early version of Amazon, but across time, how do you come to the point where you say, you know what, the important thing to do is, instead of starting a space company or whatever's next, it's education. How does that come about, and how do you end up connected with Leah? If you get comfortable saying that.
Well, I think that sort of the unwritten story, or the thing that people don't know about me, is I have 8 kids, which a lot of people think is excessive, but I wouldn't trade any of them in. And I've always taken the attitude that a father's job is to educate his kids about life. And to the extent they have certain skills, all my kids learned a certain amount about computers and software and games, and they're all game players, board games and what have you. But I think the real hard lift came when I started understanding how games can teach and how powerful the game technology is when applied to other things. And so when I thought about what could be good in the world, and which matched my skill set, I said games and education. That's kind of a center of gravity for me. And so I started pursuing it. And the more I got into it, the more I was convinced that we could make a game changer, and created a manifesto in the book that Leah and I just recently published. And so, without being too rambly, I feel like it was the right time and the right place.
And so both of you have taken this idea that you've put together, together in something that maybe transcends a podcast or 1 or 2 classrooms, but a book called Shaping the Future of Education, which is the ExoDexa manifesto. That's fabulous. Where you guys talk about a few different topics, in education, as I, read the book, and I guess I learned to read in the 70s and 80s, so maybe I didn't learn the right way, but you guys talk about things that can transform education, as I understand it, not making kids, 1.2x better, or, 15% better, but twice as good, learn twice as fast, twice as much. And some of the things that you point out are gamification might be one way to do it. And this idea has been around for a long time. I'm curious your thoughts on this. Kind of personalizing it to kids who I think learn at different speeds, perhaps. And then finally, a concept around mastery, if I understand correctly, where people are, not learning 70% of everything, but learning 100% of one thing before moving on to the next thing. Leah, how did you come to this? Like, how did you put this idea together and get so excited about it that you started a company?
Well, really, Nolan's the one who started this. And I've been working, I met Nolan through his oldest son, Brent, who is the chairman of the board of the Two Bit Circus Foundation and the co-founder of Two Bit Circus. And it was a conversation that Nolan and I had at the bar at Brent's facility in LA about what is really going on with kids in school. Like, how many of the kids that we're medicating really need the medication? Some do, but a lot of kids are just bored. And why are they bored? It's the way we're teaching them. It's not engaging. So Nolan had already written a good chunk about education, and he asked me if I would be interested in co-authoring the book with him. And who's going to say no to Nolan? That, of course, I would love to. And so it came from that. But a lot of the ideas are Nolan's original ideas that I was looking at from the perspective of someone who works in education. And then ExoDexa, I had joined the board with Nolan at ExoDexa while we were writing the book, and the rest just all sort of evolved from there.
Yeah. And so I may come from a kind of an interesting angle on this one, but as I think back to education, think about going back further than where we are today and what needs to be fixed. If we think about, say, going to school in the 70s or 80s, and people all over the world listen to this podcast, so I'm talking about the United States and my experience. People went to school and it felt like everybody was educated more or less the same way. You learn to read and write and arithmetic, and you had a biology teacher, and sometimes you had a great biology teacher and you got excited and that did something. And sometimes your biology teacher wasn't so great and you went and smoked pot between fifth and sixth period. I mean, it was kind of a standard thing around the country. Like what was wrong with that? Like, where have we come from that that's so much better today?
You want to take that first, Nolan?
Sure. It turns out that if you look at the game theory or the underpinning structure of today's education, it's really about competition. And what you know shouldn't be a competitive sport. It really should be you against the body of knowledge, if you would. And when you have competition, there will be kids who consistently, for whatever reason, end up on the bottom end of the scale, and others who end up on the top. And sometimes when you get on the bottom, you stick there because that you feel like that's where you belong. And I feel like, I'd like to make things simple. I believe that we'll know a good school when we have no grades and no grades. What I mean by that is third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, that implies batch processing.
Yeah.
And to categorize people by age, granularly or something, is incorrect. Some kids are just born differently. And so what you really want to do is have kids not selected based on age, but based on where they are, and so that they can all be challenged at the right speed, at the right pace for where they are emotionally, maturely, age-wise. Just how mature are they?
Yeah. Yeah. When I came, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, so anyway, that's kind of my center of gravity, and I believe it's correct.
Well, when I came across that idea in your book, I thought it seemed ridiculous, right? Of course, when you mean but then of course, when you think about it, you don't do that anywhere else in life. Like you don't go to work and say, "Oh, you're with the 28-year-olds." There's the 28-year-old marketing person, the 20. Of course, you're at whatever level you're at, and it seems that makes sense at school, and that seems like you're getting toward it. You've now got kids grouped around maybe a skill level. But your thought is that you can keep going, right? You can keep going until you get down to one student. Is that where it ends up?
Yeah, and it's not a total thing because group discussion is important in and of itself, because group discussion, even if you're not a participant but an observer, many times you learn things. The question that somebody asked is one that you would have asked if you were a little more confident or a little more outgoing. And so group discussion is good in and of itself. And it's also good to be able to articulate in a group. I mean, I think debate should be a requirement, because one of the things that you learn in debate is that you have to be able to debate both sides of the same argument. That all by itself is very instructive. And I think it would decrease the polarization we have, because, I would love for every Democrat to pretend they're a Republican and vice versa.
Yeah.
To kind of look for common ground to the extent. I think divisiveness is not that helpful. And things like that.
I feel like they used to do that in the schools. When I did debate, it would be like, okay, here's two sides, and you're the pro-slavery guy today, right, or whatever it was, and it kind of just made you learn to think in a way. I'm not sure people are doing that anymore. But what? So as you think about this, how do you get an average student? I think the problem that we've heard and has been laid out is you're in a school and like the teacher's teaching and half the students are just way ahead. I used to do this in school. I'd be reading 3 chapters ahead and then, Lord of the Rings on the side, right? And then there's students who are so far behind that they're just frustrated. And I think there's the concept of, it struck me when I read this, the concept
you're in that same mode.
Right.
Behind compared to what? To the same age kids?
Right.
So my construct is, can you be behind compared to yourself?
Right.
And that's, Nolan's point is a really important one, because we've known for decades that there are several different modes of learning, and yet we still work in the same singular mode that we've used since public education was first introduced.
Right.
So learning to, and I think part of your question is trying to fit something into the current system. And it really requires rethinking the system. So we still need teachers. What do teachers need to be good at? They need to be good at helping a child identify their interests and then helping them build from those interests. So you start with what the child's interested in, and then you have them engaged in their education. So if it's cars or it's baseball or whatever it is, you can start teaching with that. And then you look at all of the other areas of interest that intersect with that child's interests. And the result, having AI available now makes this job much easier for teachers. And the teacher doesn't have to be the expert on every subject that these students are researching. She or he has to be the expert on helping students find their way to the research and then discerning the research. And also what you guys were both saying about debate. I am fully on board with that. I think debate should be mandatory in every class, every age group, because it's really the only way right now that we could start to build empathy.
Right.
Being able to listen to the other side of every argument without
the most formative thing to me when I learned debate, it wasn't debating like something I believed, right? I'm really good at that. Like, here's my facts. I can talk louder than you, whatever it is. It was when someone said you debate something that you don't really agree with or you think is nonsense. And that's actually kind of hard to do, but it is how might be how you develop empathy. Is the idea, I think about when I was reading your book, the concept of, the concept of flow. I can't say the guy's name. There's a professor.
Mackay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Who I think was at Chicago. They're always at Chicago, but who had this idea. I forget how he did it, but he studied when people were most satisfied with their lives. And he figured out it wasn't when they were it was easy, like on the beach, drinking a margarita, no problem in the world, just nailing it. And it wasn't when you were so behind on a problem you couldn't figure it out. And his idea was it's actually when you've got a problem that's just a little bit harder than you can really do, but you're doing it, which kind of made me think of, like, isn't that what most video games have kind of reconstructed, right?
That's exactly what we do in video games. That's why we have levels, because as you get better, we make it harder to keep you in flow.
Yeah. And so that to me, this is kind of the central question and the most obvious one, but I'll tell it as a personal story. I played a video game 15 years ago, a ridiculous game called No One Lives Forever. It's a role-playing game. And by the way, never as magical as it was with the first Atari things, and I spent 60 hours doing this game, and I'd run into problems and I'd have to ask people how to solve them. I'd go after it and I did it. And I walked away thinking, first of all, I can't do that anymore because that's a lot of time. And I walked away with the same thought that a lot of people do, which is, boy, if I'd spent those 60 hours at that level learning Spanish, I'd be fluent, learning to play. If I had to play guitar to solve the levels, I'd be. So I feel like the idea has been around for a while, and computers have been around for a while, and yet it seems like it hasn't. Like, every kid's not fluent in Spanish, right now because of that. Why hasn't this happened? Like,
Yeah, that's exactly my interest in this, and Nolan. The conversation with Nolan came shortly after a morning with my grandson, who at the time was 6, and he was explaining to me this very elaborate story that he clearly had memorized in a video game he was playing. And my thought was, imagine if what he just learned in all of this information that he just delivered to me was of some benefit to his life.
right.
And that's where, putting the education in video games. And it's not, I mean, I think you mentioned this earlier, because it's not new. There have been people trying to gamify education for quite a while, and it's not easy. So it's not, but the majority of what's available, and I think I mentioned this in the book, it's not fooling the kids. It's educational video games. And what we would like to see is a video game forward that happens to have education in it. So the kids are playing it because they want to play it, and it happens to deliver something of value.
Right. And so how do you take your ideas into the world? And this is a Silicon Valley thing, I guess. Okay, you're in one classroom and you got one classroom working. Well, there's tens of thousands of classrooms, and you've written a book. So hopefully thousands of teachers read what you do. But why hasn't this happened in classrooms across the years where, the teacher, well, I guess I should ask first, what does the teacher become? Is the idea that you don't need 15,000 people who know biology to teach 8th grade biology, but that's actually the software teaches the biology and the teacher manages the different states of the kids? Or how does that work? Like the thing where teachers have the knowledge base, 8th grade biology as an example, replicated 100,000 times across the country with various levels of quality, I would imagine.
Yeah, it's hard to make change in education. It's not certainly not a risk-taking world. It's not a business world either. I think the challenge we're having right now in education, keeping teachers, is in part because the young teachers graduating are digital natives, and we're asking them to step back 20 years and teach according to this format that we're used to using.
Right.
And we also don't, if it were being run more as a business, you'd be looking at your success stories out there and saying, how can we replicate this? How can we make sure that fabulous math teacher in Pennsylvania can reach kids in other parts of the world? Right. That's the challenge that has never really been taken up by the system.
Right. And what is it?
Systems by their nature cannot rely on expertise. It just doesn't scale. So what you have to do is have systems do the heavy lifting and have teachers deal with edge conditions. So we want excellence in the core, in the delivery mechanism. And I'd like to say, when is the right time? And the right time is now. It was not 4 years ago, even 5 years ago. There are Chromebooks and tablets in schools today. There weren't 4 years ago. Network connection for those Chromebooks, not there.
Right.
And now there are. And so now what there needs to be is proof of efficacy. And that's our next step. We are going to take our software and A/B test it in rigorously scientific structures so that we can prove efficacy. Once you have proof of efficacy, you niche it to death. Mm-hmm. And you start with homeschoolers who have already opted out of the current broken system. And so they're more adaptable, more resonant, more ready to change. Charter schools a little more liquid, a little more okay. Parochial schools, in some cases, yes, some cases, no. And then there are certain school districts that are really looking. I just spoke to the Nevada or the Texas science teachers, and I gave a speech there and talked, and I would be willing to bet that 3/4 of the people that I spoke to are ready for a change. Mm. You could just tell by their questions that they're ready for excellence. And all you have to do is say, this is excellent and this is why, and they'll be on board.
Yeah. And it seems that at some point it would become it's hard to imagine what you describe would not create a person with a level of education that any parent would hope for their kid, that would shine. I mean, unless you're wrong, which just doesn't, it's just hard to imagine. Would the case be that the kids are just clearly so advantaged that eventually some school that was trying to do it the old way, just like a company, you can keep your, books on pen and paper for only so long. Is that what would happen eventually? Is people go, I must have this for my kids, and therefore you must give me the product I need, public school or whoever it is.
I think parents became so involved during the pandemic because they had to. And then they started to see what's not working. And I think, we've seen all the angry meetings at the school boards. Certainly don't want to see that kind of thing going on.
Right.
But I do want to see engaged parents involved in their kids' education and asking for development and asking for new options. And you see there are things popping up, like LAUSD, one of the largest in the country, has started little community schools where parents are being encouraged to get involved. And I think that there is a community of people trying to do what we're trying to do. And I would like to see the community all working together, because it's going to take more than one product. It's going to take a community building systems, building virtual reality experiences, because that's another thing I think that in the future, putting kids in the room while the founding fathers are debating the Constitution, that is not going to be cheap to put together, but that is the way to teach it in the future. Yeah. And so I think all those changes are coming, and they will be motivated by the demands of the parents, teachers, and students.
And what did people see? I heard this during the pandemic, that parents, got a view into a classroom at colleges and high schools that they haven't had in 30 years, right? And they were surprised by what they saw. What do you think they saw that surprised them?
Well, I think they saw a larger than expected amount of propaganda and ideology constructs of fringe ideas in some cases.
Yeah.
And I think that was off-putting. Then I think they also saw a certain amount of what they would consider, and their kid, it's one thing for your kids to come home and say, I just hate busy work. And then have the parents constructed and inverse and say, yeah, this is kind of busy work. This is not effective teaching.
Right.
Yeah, I think they saw how disengaged the students are as well. Like when they didn't have to be in a classroom, and we're asking them to do their homework on the same device they could play Minecraft on. I mean, it's just not a good situation. And teachers, I think, have been underappreciated for a long time. That they do. The system, dealing with the system became really problematic for a lot of parents. And the homeschool world grew considerably these last few years.
Yeah. Where did the ideology piece in schools, why did that happen? Because my little example of the 70s or 80s, like you touch a math and they touch you this and that, but there was no ideology in math. It was just, you liked it or you didn't, and you liked trigonometry or you didn't. And it's just become, it seems a very odd path.
Social media increase the social value of being a victim. And So all of a sudden, people found that if they could become a victim, their chips were more valuable. And I think that, you know, any system that is based on people, you're going to find those people who become victims and they want to emote to everybody else and get them on their victimhood side. And I think that is social media is kind of a toxic driver to some of these ethos.
Yeah. So as you have this idea, how does this idea win? In the sense of, my understanding is that there's people bring ideas to the education battlefield, right? Like I don't understand it well, but I think there's a reading concept that got widely adopted. That wasn't about teaching words, but it's called structured reading or unstructured or something, where you think about reading versus reading or whatever. And whether it works or not, some people think it does, some people think it doesn't. It's what your kid gets. And whoever was behind that idea is winning or was winning for a while. How do you create a system such that the world doesn't end up with, like, unlike before, just a bunch of different things going on in different schools, like some people doing something that works and some people doing something that doesn't, but that's an ideology? Like,
there will be that for a while. Like,
yeah.
I think
Right.
there'll be a transition period where there are a couple of places. There's a high-tech high down in San Diego that's doing a lot of what we're talking about. The Da Vinci schools here in Los Angeles also trying to do a lot of what we're talking about. If you walk through a Da Vinci high school, you'd think, hey, nobody's in class here. They're all sitting around in different groups having their conversations, like an office building,
Right.
where they run more like the world.
Yeah.
And I think that what Nolan and I are right now, the challenge is we need to raise enough money to be able to do what we're professing here. We'd like to start with a school event. That's the sort of down the road. We start with the game, but then once we have the game up and running, I think being able to open a school and test all of our ideas and do the research is what the next stage is.
That's incredible. And so what happened? What in the larger sense, aside from the money, what are you fighting? The idea seems so clear. It's some form of it's, geez, we should be using computers a little bit better in the classroom. It's been around for a while. Is it administrators? Is it unions? Is it, because I could absolutely see you paint the picture so beautifully. A young person comes out of school, they want to teach, and they're like, what? It's just some archaic. They don't have a game. They don't have the tool. They don't have maybe the money if they're at the wrong school. Of course, they're frustrated and go become a, product manager number 10,001. What do you need to overcome to create this world where it just seems obvious that kids would just be more fulfilled, more appropriately educated?
I think we need a little bit of time to test it out. I think that it won't. I don't think we will have the kinds of roadblocks that a lot of organizations have dealt with, in part because we are like game forward, educators wrapped around it. So all of what we're trying to do is to put the best of what we can offer in that game and then get it to the parents and the kids. And then I think the movement happens from there. There will be fear. Look at the way everybody handled the advent of open AI in the classroom. It was everybody had their hair on fire. It was awful. It was the worst thing. And my first thought on it was like, okay, they're gonna write their papers with Chat GPT. That's just a given. And for the rest of their lives, they will have access to this. So let's teach them the ethical use of it. Let's teach them how to fact check it. And it levels the playing field for any of the kids. I grew up a slow learner. I did not do my graduate work until I was in my 50s. So I didn't even think I had the potential for most of my life to do a PhD, in part because of the feedback I got all my life from teachers. You read too slow. Everything. I just wasn't a good student because I am better. I hear things more effectively than I read them.
Yeah.
So, I'm one of those kids that learns that way. I didn't fit in this system. I think it's more than half of the children in school who don't fit in the current system. So that half getting engaged will swing the pendulum, I think, in favor of us.
The chat GPT thing it just reminded me of something funny when everyone's worried about chat GPT. I remember in college, a different time, but you had things called Cliff Notes where you could kind of read the Cliff Notes and cheat, and you could order from the back of Rolling Stone magazine. You could order an essay and take 6 weeks to get there. And a professor once said to me, the kids who actually do that, who go do the Cliff Notes and get the essay, they put so much work into it. They actually understand the material better than anybody. And so,
right.
Of course, chat GPT is how you're going to do it, and you're going to learn how to do that, and you're going to get smarter at that. And
well, and if we're testing for what they've learned, then we can have them present their paper instead of handing it in. They stand in front of the class and present their ideas in their paper and do a Q&A, and you'll know who learned it and who didn't.
Yeah.
And it gives them some public speaking experience.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. Well, everybody should, my theory is everybody should take acting in high school and college, but don't go into that business. It's a great thing to know. It's a rough business. I mean, I'll wind up with like a couple of things for you guys. And Nolan, I'm curious your thoughts. Growing up in a world where you didn't have these technologies that were so well formed in games and movies, and you would read a book, and in particular for a certain group of people, science fiction books, or your imagination would take you far beyond what Pong actually was. Am I wrong to be nostalgic for that time when you would, spend days reading Lord of the Rings or Ring World or whatever science fiction it is, or is that just how technology moves on?
I think it's how technology moves on. I mean, I can't imagine any of my kids spending hours reading the encyclopedia like I did growing up.
That's right.
There's some, and the thing that was very interesting about reading an encyclopedia is the information was sequentially alphabetic.
Yeah.
And so you had a biography of a famous person right next to a biological plant and next to a chemical formula. And so there was this constant fascination with the diversity of information.
Yeah.
But what you talk about the difficulty of diffusion. I actually think good ideas are like a virus. And it can be as potent as COVID-19. And you know what one of the vectors of the mind virus is? Our book.
Yes.
And I think that it would be difficult for someone to demonize Leah and I based on the concepts in the book.
Yeah.
It's all about efficacy. It's all about how do we create a more resilient individual, child, adult, what have you. What does the technology tell us? How do we integrate biology, exercise, nutrition? What's best? No breakfast, high carb breakfast, high protein breakfast, high fat breakfast. These are things that we can know, and we will be better. And I think the answer is going to be different for different kids.
Yeah.
A lot of things that are noisy in the data sphere are because we have differences that don't track data-wise. Like if half the kids in a class do better with a high protein breakfast, and they try to test what's going to happen with different breakfasts, the data is going to come back noisy because only half are responding to that particular solution.
Yeah.
So what I think is the second part of the game manifesto is data. I think we're going to know so much more about how kids learn, what kids respond to, how we can mentor kids through AI. Every AI tutor now allows any kid, no matter of their financial circumstances, to be mentored, to have a tutor,
Yep.
to help on these edge conditions where they don't quite understand. They need a little more rigor. And is it fast? Doesn't matter. Speed is taken out of the equation. Age taken out of the equation. Some kids have a home life that make homework impossible. In our world, no grades, no homework, no judgment, no competition. And I believe that that fixes the world. But that's just one man's opinion.
That's fantastic. No grades, no homework should be the name of your next book. By the way, this book, Shaping the Future of Education, I left it, and it feels like a book that you want to share with people in the sense that it doesn't really feel like it just, it's not obvious isn't the right word because you guys are really thoughtful, but it just seems like the problem when you're done with the book, you're like, how does this, it just has to happen. You don't think, I don't know, this doesn't make sense. This is the crazy ideology. You just want to give it to 5 people or 10 teachers, or people who can make things happen. It's, you kind of leave it with that kind of optimism. What are you guys optimistic about as we kind of wrap up here?
I am really optimistic about 2024. I mean, I love working with Nolan. I think what we're doing is important work. And I feel like getting up every day is a privilege to go at this.
And, you know, we hit Amazon's bestseller list first week we were out there.
Wow.
That's encouraging to me, you know, because who in the hell goes out and looks for an education book, you know?
Right.
And you know what happens? Success breeds success. There's this thing called the Pareto principle, and the more successful you are, the more successful you become. It's a positive feedback structure, and I put my marketing hat on every once in a while, and once you have efficacy, you can have all kinds of fun. For example, let's suppose that I were to offer $1 million reward match off to a school that, and the wager is follows. They can take 100 kids. We'll take 100 kids. You teach your 100 kids any way you want to with your best teachers, your best methodology. We'll teach our 100 kids with our best technology and our best methodology. And at the end of that, we'll do a test administered by Pete Marmuk or some reputable body. And whoever wins gets the $1 million. Now, is anybody going to pick that up? I don't think so. But do you think I'll get a few headlines? Absolutely.
That's right.
True.
I mean, I shouldn't be snarky like that, but that's the way my brain works.
Sure, you should. This is great. It's a fabulous book. If you haven't read it yet, Shaping the Future of Education, Dr. Leah Hanes and Nolan Bushnell. Thank you guys so much for doing this. Other than getting the book on Amazon or wherever you get your books, how else should people find you and follow your thinking on this?
Actually, we've just started something called a Founders Circle where we're going to do office hours with Nolan once a quarter. And so on our website, there's a way to sign. It costs $1 to sign up for the Founders Circle, but that also is the group that will be the beta testers and the feedback loop for us for the game.
Cool.
Yeah, and the only reason we put $1 on it, because we want to, there's this thing called KYC, you know, your customer.
Mhm.
And so, you know, that when you get $1 from somebody, you get rid of all the bots, because
That's
for
right.
some reason the bots don't have money.
That's right. That's great.
Thank
All
you.
right. Well, guys, the book, Shaping the Future of Education, Nolan Bushnell, Dr. Leah Hanes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye now.